All right, we're ready for 1 Peter chapter 5. Let's review where we've been. Chapter 1, what was it about? Yeah, be holy in all of your conduct. Here was a call to be holy. We'll say more about that in a moment. What was chapter 2 about? All right, privileges and duties of being holy. Don't forget the theme of the book. Now, we're coming back to that in just a moment. Chapter 3, more duties of holiness, husbands and wives, etc. And then chapter 4 last time dealt with is a pure life. Very good. All right. Remember the theme of the book, chapter 1, because this is our last time in the book. So let's go back to chapter 1, 15 and 16. If you don't have this marked, this might be a good time to mark that. Chapter 1, verses 15 and 16 deal with the concept of being holy in all of your conduct. And so the whole book deals with holiness. And we're going to talk more about that as we go on. Now, in today's lesson, we're talking about more duties of holiness. Here are some more expressions of duties and responsibilities, particularly with reference to elders and with reference to those who are younger, those who may follow their leadership. Now, we'll say more about that in a moment. Here's what chapter 1 was. In view of this theme of holiness and all of your conduct, here's the call to be holy. Here are a number of reasons why you need to be holy. What does that mean then? Well, that starts in chapter 2. And so it means you lay away sin and you grow. Here's some privileges with reference to that. It has to do with the family life. It has to do with how you conduct yourself when you're suffering. Take note of the suffering. We're going to say more about that in a moment. In chapter 4, it has to do with a pure life. And then coming back to this concept of suffering. Now, he ended chapter 4 on the note of suffering. Notice verse 19, let those who suffer according to the will of God. He's talking about a context of suffering and oppression. And what I want you to see is, in verses 1 to 4, as we talk about elders, that elders are there to help guide and guard you even in the midst of suffering. And we'll say more about that here in just a moment. That's the context I wanted you to see. All right, so chapter 5, here's an outline of chapter 5. I call it further duties of holiness. Here's the duties of elders. And then here's the duties of those who are younger and others, not just those who are younger. And then finally some conclusions and salutations, and he finishes the book. So he starts on the note of elders. So let's go to our questions for today, and then we'll come back to our material. Question number 1, the duties. List the duties of elders as found in verses 1 to 4. What do you see? All right, they're to shepherd the flock. They have the oversight, so they're to oversee the flock. Be an example to the flock. What's another word for shepherd here? Some translations may say you need to oversee is mentioned in addition to that. Pastor or to feed the flock. Feed the flock of God or shepherd the flock of God. Same concept. We'll say more about that here in just a second. All right, we'll come back to questions 2, 3, and 4 and 5 here in just a moment as we talk about elders. Let's talk about the duty of elders. Though the instructions in this context are given to elders, it's easy for us to say, you know what, I'm not an elder and I never will be an elder. I'm not interested in being an elder. I'm not qualified to be an elder. And so this doesn't apply to me. I just skip verses 1 to 4. What value is there for lack of better expression, non-elders understanding verses 1 to 4? Is there even a need for that?
Young men may be looking ahead in their life to be an elder, and also men that are not elders looking to see what is required.
All right, yeah. Young men need to look forward to being elders one day and working. Here's what's involved. I'm convinced there have been people who've been appointed as elders who didn't really have a clue what elders do. And so understand from the beginning, long before you ever become an elder, here's what elders are, here's what they do, here's their job, here's their role, here's their qualities, here's their responsibility. But Stephen also made a point that I've got on the screen here on point number 2, and here's what it means to those that the elders lead. And so, are the elders doing what they're supposed to do? Are you in a church where elders are doing something that's unauthorized? Are they going beyond their authority? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? That's important if you're not an elder, to know what an elder is supposed to be doing. Is he doing his job? Are we being overseen as we should be overseen? Do the elders that we have understand what their role and responsibility may be? I want us to look at verses 1 and 2 from this vantage point. I want us to start with who the elders are and what they do, verses 1 and 2. First of all, in verse 1, they're called elders. What does the word elder suggest to you? Has to do with age. It generally had reference to one who was older. It literally meant a bearded one. And it's the idea of one who has some age. What does that mean? How does that play to the eldership?
Because someone is older, we would assume he's been around. Of course, he's been around, but he's more mature and he's well learned in God's law and His will.
Okay, he's not a novice. Isn't that one of the qualifications? What does a novice mean? That's a word used in 1 Timothy 3. I'm sorry? Rookie, yeah, he's new. He's a new convert. So it suggests maturity and wisdom and an age, one whose guidance would be dependable. And so you don't put someone who is, for lack of a better expression, a greenhorn in as a leader in any position. You put someone in who has some experience and some wisdom and some maturity. That's the idea of being an elder. More about the word elder in a moment. But then there's the term shepherd. In verse 2, shepherd the flock, the King James uses the word feed the flock of God. Now, what does the idea of shepherd suggest to you? All right, the tender care of. In fact, the American Standard says they're to tend the flock. King James says feed the flock. Shepherd the flock. What else does it suggest to you? Yeah, make sure they're going in the right direction. It's the idea that he's, by the way, it's the same word for pastor in Ephesians 4 and verse 11. It means he cares and tends for the flock. It means that he cares and he's concerned for the welfare of the sheep. He's very concerned about the welfare of the sheep. Clinton Hamilton made this observation in his work on 1 Peter, that a shepherd or feeding the flock means the work should be done with vigor and with energy and not merely a routine undertaking. It's just not like, okay, here we have a job, but they care about the sheep. All right, there's another term that's used. There's three terms that are used here. One is the overseers. Notice that at verse 2, serving as overseers. What does the idea of overseers suggest to you? Yes, yeah. It's the same word for bishop. It means to superintend, to look upon or to inspect, monitor, see what's going on. They direct the affairs of the congregation. I want you to notice all three terms. In the original, there were three terms that referred to elders, translated by 6 different English terms. There's the word presbyteros, which is translated elders, and presbytery in 1 Timothy chapter 4. That's used in verse 1. Same thing happens, by the way, in Acts 20. Episkopos, the word translated overseers, verse 2, is the same word for bishop in Philippians 1 and verse 1. And the word poimon is the word for shepherd at verse 2, translated pastor in Ephesians chapter 4. So they are bishops, they're overseers, they're pastors, they're presbyters, they're elders, they're shepherds. All of 6 of those terms, or 3 original terms, are used to describe those who are elders. Here's who they are. It describes something of their roles, something of their quality, something of what they are supposed to be doing. Now, look at verses 2 and 3, and let's get ready to go to questions number 2, 3, and 4. Let's talk about how they lead. How are they to lead according to verse 2?
By example.
All right, they lead by example. The first thing mentioned, though, is not by constraint, but willingly. Question 2, what does that mean? All right? No one's forcing them to do that. It's not as if it's a burden or something to be resented, but he voluntarily does that. Doesn't mean he just decides, you know what, I'm going to be an elder, so I'm now one. I just signed up and I'm an elder. He has to be appointed to the job. to the office. But what would you think about the person that you beg and beg and beg to become an elder, and he keeps saying no and no and no? Doesn't need to be one, does he? Not if we have to beg and beg and push. You need to be an elder. If he doesn't want it, he doesn't need to be it. He doesn't meet the qualification. Good point. All right? So it just simply means it's not a burden. He doesn't resent it. He voluntarily does it. All right, question number 3. What does this mean? Not for dishonest gain, but eagerly. All right, it's not for money. 1 Timothy 5 says he could be paid for that, couldn't he? Sure he could. But he's not doing it merely for that, just as preachers should not do it merely for the money. What else does it mean? Not for personal gain or for power. He's not out for, I'm in this role so I can promote myself. Yeah, it's not for personal gain, but he works with enthusiasm. It's not for dishonest gain, but he's eagerly doing that. The third thing mentioned, not as lords over them, but examples. Question number 4, how could elders be lords over the church? They're leaders, they're supposed to be. Go ahead.
Don't take any feedback when suggestions are made, when something's brought up, you say no, they just shoot it straight down.
Okay.
And it's our way, it's, there's no feedback amongst the flock. Like you guys ask for feedback and encourage feedback on certain things, and you say, come to me when you have an issue, and we'll discuss it. They might, in the other side of the bill is like, wouldn't take no kind of feedback, don't want to talk to anybody.
All right. Good point. Isn't that the parallel with a man leading his wife? Could he lord over his wife? Sure he could. He's the leader. He could say it's going to be this way. I'm not interested in what you have to say. I'm not listening to you. Or he could take some input from her, yet still be the leader. He could listen to the criticism she offers. He could listen to the suggestions she makes and take those suggestions and still be the leader. Not being lords over them. What else?
Being good enough to be, overbearing, and he can make decisions that don't affect the congregation, but it's the Lord of the Lord, he takes the position himself to honor himself.
Okay. He's not trying to honor himself. Notice on the screen, he's not domineering and mastering, but the contrast of being an example is in contrast to being a lord over. I think the point being made is that elders lead rather than drive. Does that make sense? What does that suggest to you? Yeah. You can't herd cats, can you? Yeah, show the way. People can be led easier than they can be driven. And so rather than trying, we're going to force everything in this direction, lead in that direction. And lead with such qualities that they'll want to follow after you. Yes?
Also, the elders mentioned probably what you said, but the elders should do what's best for the congregation.
Right. They should be interested in that. Let's talk about the responsibility they have. And I'm not talking about their work so much as they are to feed or they're to shepherd and they're to oversee, but the idea of the weighty responsibility elders have, as mentioned here in the context. Let's see what he says. Look at verse 2. They are to feed. He didn't say they're to shepherd the flock, but they're to shepherd the flock of God. What does that suggest to you? It belongs to God. This isn't their flock. This isn't something they own. This is something that belongs to God. Now, what does that suggest to you? I'm looking for a word. Stewardship. And so elders are to be stewards. They are feeding the flock that's not their own. Now, this is quite interesting at verse 3. They are verse 4, actually. Verse 3. Not as being lords over those entrusted to you. Look at that phrase, those entrusted to you. That comes from a word that means charge or allotment. The American Standard so translates that. It's a lot or a portion that has been assigned to the elders. And so in other words, the point is they've been given into your charge. It's like someone taking a bunch of money and say, I want you to take care of this. This is my money, but you're in charge of this. And you're to be responsible for that. And so the flock you've been charged with that. That's the point I want you to see. They're God's heritage. One translation says that you've been entrusted with. And then verse 4, let's finish this thought and then we'll see what questions and comments you have. At verse 4, they're accountable to the chief shepherd. What do you learn from verse 4?
They're shepherds and God is a shepherd, and they need to be the example of God to the flock above them.
All right, yeah. That they got to recognize that I'm a shepherd over this flock, but I'm going to have to give an account to my ultimate shepherd, which is the Lord. And so what I'm driving at is this context points 3 times to the weighty responsibility. You're feeding God's flock, not your own. You've been entrusted with God's heritage. You've been given this stewardship, and you're accountable to the chief shepherd. What a weighty responsibility that he lays upon them. Hamilton observes in his work concerning elders that they are to feed the flock of the Word of God, to observe their behavior, and to assist them in living according to the will of God through correction, guidance, being examples, molds, patterns to them, and giving encouragement. I certainly agree with that. I think the point to be made is right in the middle of all of this suffering, chapter 4, chapter 3, you have somebody to help guide and correct and comfort and encourage you. Does that make sense? Elders are not the only ones, but they're there for that purpose. Now, this may not stand out to you, but Titus mentions elders in the context of being sound in the faith. And I think his whole point is elders are placed there to help maintain your strong, sound faith. Guard and protect your sound faith. In this context of holiness, elders are there to help you be holy. Does that make sense? That's their role. That's their responsibility. They're there not as checkbook elders, but to help you live the holy life. Questions or comments? Yes, sir.
It basically boils down to God has delegated his authority down to Christ to the believing and faithful elders of each congregation. Because for you to be in charge, you got to have some kind of authority, and the authority is coming from God.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I wonder what Steve said about the young people desiring an office here, in which we have elders here. It makes it a whole lot easier for them to see what their responsibility thing is. I want to use myself as an example. In '96, when we appointed elders, I had no clue what was ahead of me. And I would get into situations I wouldn't know what to do with it. But I learned, and that's most of the thing you do. You learn under the eldership you're under. It makes it a whole lot easier than not being around eldership all your life, then you take up the position.
Good point. I told George he's like Jerry Clower, who said the first college football game he ever saw, he played in it. And the first eldership that George was a part of or was around, he was in it and had not seen any, had not witnessed the examples of elders. Yes, ma'am.
Playing on what he said, Peter mentioned here that he was with Christ's suffering, and most likely, most people knew of what happened when Christ was going through his suffering, and Peter denied him, but also of the leadership that Peter showed in the first church in Jerusalem. So he had a broad range of experience behind him that he's using to say, I saw the suffering of Christ. You're going to see suffering in your congregation. It's coming, and it's going to be in a broad range of ways. They may come from outside, it may come from family suffering, it may come from other things. And here's what you do. Here's how you conduct yourself so that you can lead the church.
Good point. Good point. Question 5. What do you see in these verses about local church autonomy? Is there anything in verses 1 to 4? Yeah. The elders of this church have the responsibility to shepherd the flock among them. It means we have no oversight with any other church. That's local church autonomy. And the elders of that church have the responsibility to oversee that church and have no insight or oversight of this church. And that's part of the beauty of God's plan. I want to say one more thing before we leave that, and I know we're running a little behind, but on this weighty responsibility we just talked about just a moment ago that elders have. It's much like being as a kid. When you're a kid, you think, boy, I can't wait till I get to be a parent where I get to be the boss and be in control. And what do you learn once you become a parent? Yeah, you wish you were a kid again. It's not really so much being a boss, but it's a weighty responsibility being a parent. And the same thing with being, boy, I wished I could be the elders and make the decisions. It's more weighty responsibility when it falls on your shoulder when there's a problem. Somebody said, what are you going to do about it? Where it was kind of nice when you could point to the elders. I don't know what they're going to do. The question is, what are you going to do now? And they're pointing to you as one of the elders. It's a weighty responsibility, more than some system of authority. All right, let's move on now and talk about verses 5 through 11. This is the duty of younger and those who are, or others besides just those who are younger. The first thing he mentions in verses 5 and 6 is humility. That's going to be needed. Likewise, you younger people submit to elders. But let's talk about what humility means. Obviously, self-denial. It's opposed to being proud. Verse 6, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. I want you to notice at verse 5, be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. The word clothed, the American Standard says, gird yourself with humility. What does that suggest to you? Something you put on. In John 13, do you remember the occasion when Jesus washed the disciples' feet? Remember him girding himself with a servant's garment? And then he washed their feet. The greatest demonstration of humility. I say the greatest, that wasn't as great as his sacrifice on the cross, but a great demonstration of humility. Peter may have been thinking about that because Peter was there. He saw that. That what we need is, we need people who clothe themselves and tie on this principle of humility, bound on, put on a slave's apron. Now notice this point right here. I know what it means here. Let's talk about what we do. You show humility by subjection. Verse 5, likewise you younger submit to your elders. Yes, every one of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. There is a connection between humility and submissive to those who lead. That's true in the family. That's true in the church. It's true in the nation. So that involves submission. But what's the sense in which we are all submissive to one another? We're to submit to the elders. That's true. We got that. But there is a sense in which we submit to one another. I'm to submit to you. You're to submit to me. How do we submit to one another?
Being willing to compromise. It's not a matter of truth and not always insisting on your own way.
All right. Not insisting it's on your own way. What was Jesus doing in John 13? Was he serving his disciples or his disciples serving him? He was serving them, wasn't he? And he was the master. Could we not say we submit to one another in service as we care and serve one another in seeing to their needs? That involves humility. So we show humility by subjection. We show humility toward our leaders. We show humility toward those who are older. You who are younger, submit to your elders. And so showing respect for those who are older is part of humility. Show me some young person who has no respect for those who are older, and I'll show you somebody that's already arrogant and will be terribly arrogant as they get older. Would you agree with that? Yeah, very much so. Now look at verse 5, at the end of verse 5. For God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Quotes from Proverbs 3. Verse 34. That's not exactly what Proverbs 3:34 said. And that's quite interesting. What does Proverbs 3:34 say?
Although he is scornful to the arrogant scoffers, yet he shows favor to them.
Yeah. That's the word I'm looking for here. I've lost my verse here. What did I tell you? Proverbs what? 3:34. I've got 24. It helps if you get the right one. Yeah, the New King James words that, surely he scorns the scornful And this is being translated out of the Hebrew, whereas Peter's probably quoting from the Septuagint translation, probably the different. But it's interesting to me that those who are proud, according to 1 Peter 5, in verse 5, are said to be the scornful of Proverbs 3. Does that make sense? Those who are scornful are people who are full of pride. That's the point I'm trying to make. People who scorn and reject the Word of God, people who reject God and His Word and are scornful of others and are scornful of God are people who indeed are proud. Now let's go on to verse 7. Well, let's get verse 6 about being proud. I'm going to skip that. Let's go to verse 7. Here's another duty. You submit to those who are, you submit to others in humility. So that's one responsibility. The second is to put your trust and confidence in God. Verse 7. What do you learn from verse 7?
God cares for us so much that we can put all our troubles and cares on Him.
You cast your care upon Him. The American Standard takes that word care and translates it anxiety. It's the same word for care in Philippians 4. It is dealing with anxiety or worry. So he's talking about a life that's without worry, without fretfulness, and without anxiety. How about putting worry aside? Now what's interesting about this, he may be quoting from, alluding to, not a direct quote from Psalm 55 and verse 2, that even in the midst of suffering, put all anxiety aside. Cast your care upon Him. Hamilton says it matters to God what happens to Christians. God cares. And that's the point being made. But I want you to notice the connection with humility. What is the connection with humility? He just talked about humility, and then he says, and as the New King James has worded it or has translated it, they make that a part of the same sentence, casting your cares upon God.
It takes humility to do that. I mean, you've got to humble yourself and realize that you got to release all that care upon to Him.
All right.
It takes humility to do that.
All right, you're right. It takes humility. Let's go further. Why do we say it takes humility?
Because we think we're so self-sufficient.
Yeah. When I think I'm going to handle all these worries myself, I'm going to handle all this anxiety myself, that's pretty arrogant, isn't it? I don't need God. I'm not going to cast it all upon God because I'm going to handle this myself. I can figure all this out. I don't need His help. That's arrogance. So someone who's carrying all of their anxieties and all their cares and they're worried all the time is a person who's full of pride, is what he's saying. It takes humility to say, you know what, I cast that upon God and I'm not worried about that, even in the midst of suffering. Well, let's go on. Here's the next thing that he mentions. Be sober. What does the word sober mean? All right, clear mind. Footnote will say self-controlled, calmness of mind. Well-balanced, serious approach to life. BDAG says it means well-balanced. Yeah, it's the same word translated watch in chapter 4, verse 7. We're to be watchful. Does it mean to be free of intoxicants? Sure, it included in that, but it goes further than that. It's calmness, self-control, etc. Now he says vigilant. What's the word vigilant mean? Watchful. Your footnote may say watchful. Be on alert. To stay awake. Spiritual alertness. Here's something I learned from that. Casting your cares upon God doesn't mean you have nothing to do. So it doesn't mean that I cast all my cares upon Him, I'm just going to sit back and do nothing. I still need to be watchful and spiritually alert to dangers, etc. So I need to be sober, I need to be watchful, be vigilant. What's the next thing mentioned? Yeah. All right, notice what he says. He first of all calls him our adversary. What's an adversary? It's your enemy. It's an opponent in a lawsuit. An opponent in a lawsuit is not your friend. They're out to get you. And so he is your enemy. He is your opponent. He is your adversary. He's roaring. What does that suggest? He's fierce. He walks about as a roaring lion. He's compared to a lion. He's not a lion, but he's compared to a lion, which suggests the idea perhaps he stalks and he destroys. A lion is not your friend. A lion is out to destroy you. And he's walking about Reminds me of Job 1. Remember Job 1? Walking to and fro in the earth. Satan was walking to and fro, looking, seeing who he may devour. It suggests a restless energy, looking to see what I can get and who I can get next. Who's going to be my next victim? Where can I get someone? Where can I tempt someone? He's walking about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Now then, yes, ma'am.
Does it also suggest that he is recognizable? Because if the Lord be watchful, we have to be able to see it, and if he's roaring, we should be able to hear it. So it's not something that we're snuck up on, so it's something that we can be aware of if we're humble and don't have ourselves lifted so high that we can't see.
All right, good point. Humility helps us with that. Now, when we resist him, before we get to the three things that's going to be on the screen, notice at verse 9, resist him steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same suffering experienced by the brotherhood in the world. In other words, you're not the only one going through this, so you can resist the devil and you can overcome. Now, there are three results I want us to focus on in the last 5 minutes. The first is in verse 10. If we resist the devil, we can be strengthened. Let's talk about some words that are used here. Look at verse 10. But may the grace of God who called you to eternal life, we'll come back to that, after that you suffered a while, perfect, number one. What does the word perfect suggest to you? Complete. Yeah, it means, it's the word, by the way, translated mending, as in mending the nets. May God perfect you. You may have a hole in your net, your spiritual net, but you resist the devil, you start mending that net. You repair, you make complete, you make it back to where it ought to be. All right? May God perfect you and establish you. What does the idea of establish suggest to you? Confirm, or to make firm. One writer says it means to make firm or stable that which totters. And so you may be tottering. And so God can establish you, make you firm. Secondly, or thirdly, that he may strengthen you. Let's look at this word strengthen. It means to make strong against an attack. And then the next word that he uses is he might settle you. All these are describing firmness and being strengthened and being made strong. And that's all done through suffering if we maintain our faith. You stay strong in the faith and resist the devil even through all that suffering, then you're going to be made perfect, you're going to be made stronger, you're going to be established, you're going to be settled. Barclay says suffering is meant by God to add the grace notes to life. I think that's a good insight to what's being said. Let's go now to verse 11. The next thing that's mentioned, these are results of resisting. You're going to be stronger. What's the next thing, verse 11? God's going to be glorified. Yeah, God's going to be glorified. That is, if any man suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed but glorify God on this behalf. 1 Peter chapter 4, that's a doxology, a hymn or a song. And yet he's saying that God's going to be glorified. Go back to verse 10. There's a third result. God called us to eternal life. Verse 10. So resist the devil. And here's what's going to happen. Here's three things that's going to happen. You're going to be strengthened, God's going to be glorified, and you have eternal life. Does that make sense? Now let's quickly get verses 12 to 13, 12 to 14. It's not that they're unimportant. That's just the salutation. They are very important. What do you see in verse 12 about the purpose of writing? I've written to you briefly. This was a short letter, and it is. Yeah, this is a word of exhortation. I exhort and testify that this is the true grace of God in which you stand. In other words, I'm trying to demonstrate to you that you need to be holy in all of your conduct, and you stand fast wherein you know what is the truth. This is the truth wherein you stand. What you've been taught is the truth. I'm trying to tell you that. And don't let any form of suffering or any persecution, any problem shake you from that. Make sense? And then finally, there is the salutations of verses 13 and 14. All right, questions or comments on 1 Peter 5?
Writing
Say again?
The writings we have today, the Bible is just another form of the grace of God.
Absolutely. It's a form of the grace of God. All right, practical things we learned. We got maybe 1.5 minutes to go. Practical things you learned.
Now to go back to verse 8, where it talks about the devil walks around as a roaring lion. A lion represents power, and the devil is very powerful. You go back up to verse 5, where it says we should be submissive to one another and be clothed in humility. We try to go through our Christian lives by ourselves, we'll never make it. We're here to help each other. And numbers create power.
Good point. Well,
That analogy you used about seeking, the devil is seeking. We need to be vigilant. I think about hunters realize this, if you're out, if you're in an area where there are, could be dangerous bears or lions, and you're in that situation where you know they're there, but you can't see them, but you know they're in the area because of the evidence. You get that fear in you, like, I've got to be watching because they could be around any corner. And I think about that when I read
Yeah.
that. God, the devil's there. He's just waiting for you to slip up.
Yeah.
He's gonna jump.
he's looking for every opportunity that he can. 2 Peter 1 next time is where we'll start into 2 Peter. It's a different book, different theme, same writer, but we're going to start there. And then we'll go to 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, then Jude, and then we go to the Old Testament. 2 Peter 1 next time.